A tooth, 7,000 years old, pulled from red clay in the Basque country, intact enough to yield DNA. For over a century, science called the Basques the original Europeans, the ancestral population, the purest surviving line from the continent's earliest settlers. That was the accepted answer, the one in textbooks, the one repeated without challenge for generations. But when that tooth was sequenced against the full map of ancient European genetics, the answer collapsed. The Basques were not the origin of Europeans. They were the last remnant of a Europe that everyone else left behind. No one buried that. The data did. The mountains along the border of Spain and France are not the tallest in Europe. They are not the most dramatic. They do not carry the weight of famous battles or legendary kingdoms. But in the valleys pressed between those ridges, something has been sitting quietly for longer than any European nation, any European language, any European institution that still exists today. 3 million people. One language. No known relatives. Euskara, the Basque language, is what linguists call a language isolate. That term sounds technical. What it means is this. Every language on Earth belongs to a family. French, English, Russian, Hindi. Trace any of them back far enough and they connect. Every Indo-European language traces to a common ancestor spoken somewhere on the Eurasian steppe roughly 5,000 to 6,000 years ago. Every Semitic language connects. Every Sino-Tibetan language connects. Euskara connects to nothing, not to Latin, not to any Indo-European branch, not to any language, living or extinct, that has ever been identified. It is alone in a way that should have prompted far more urgent questions than it did. To understand the time frame involved, when the Basque ancestral population was already established in that corner of the Iberian Peninsula, the pyramids at Giza had not yet been built. By the time Rome was founded, those people had already been there for thousands of years. By the time Europeans arrived in the Americas, the Basque language had been spoken in those mountains longer than Latin had existed as a language anywhere. The accepted explanation for all of this was straightforward, and it was wrong. The Basques' mainstream science argued for most of the 20th century were the original Europeans, descendants of the first modern humans to settle the continent. Paleolithic hunters whose population had persisted in genetic and linguistic isolation while the rest of Europe changed around them. They were the ancestors, the source. The root from which modern European populations eventually grew. It was a compelling story. And there's a version of it that is partially true. But the part that matters most, the part that carries the weight of the title claim, the part that determines what the Basques actually are in the history of this continent, turns out to be precisely backwards. Some researchers went further. For decades, a persistent fringe argument held that the Basques were not just isolated, but fundamentally different at a biological level. The evidence cited was their blood type. Basques carry ORH negative at a frequency of approximately 35%, the highest rate of any population on Earth, compared to a European average of around 16%. From this, certain writers concluded that the Rh negative factor marks something genuinely alien, a non-European origin, a connection to a lost civilization, in some versions a non-human ancestry. These arguments found large audiences. They were not supported by any peer-reviewed evidence, but they pointed, in a distorted way, at a real signal that something in Basque genetics was genuinely unlike anything else on the continent. That part was correct. Everything else those theories built on top of it was not. The real answer required a different kind of evidence entirely. Archaeogenetics works by recovering ancient DNA from two primary sources: teeth whose pulp chambers preserve genetic material even after thousands of years of soil contact, and the petrous bone, the hardest bone in the human skull, located just behind the ear, capable of protecting DNA through conditions that would destroy almost any other organic tissue. Researchers extract that material, sequence it, and compare it against databases containing hundreds of ancient and modern genomes from across the world. The result is a genetic map of human movement: who came from where, who mixed with whom, and who did not. In 2015, a team led by Wolfgang Hack and published in Nature sequenced 69 ancient European genomes in a single study, the largest dataset of its kind at that point. What they found restructured the entire model of European prehistory. Modern Europeans, it turned out, were not descended from one founding population or even two. They carried DNA from three distinct ancestral groups: the hunter-gatherers who had inhabited Europe since the last ice age, the early farmers who had migrated from Anatolia beginning around 9000 BCE, and a third population, Yamnaya pastoralists from the Pontic Caspian steppe, who had moved west in a massive expansion beginning around 300 BCE. That third wave was not a gentle migration. In Central and Northern Europe, researchers found that Yamnaya-related ancestry replaced up to 75% of the existing population's DNA within a few centuries. The people who had built the megalithic monuments, buried their dead in long barrows, farmed the same land for thousands of years. They were largely gone from the genetic record, replaced by newcomers from the steppe. Almost everywhere. In 2019, Inigo Olalde and colleagues published a study in Science analyzing 170 ancient skeletons from across the Iberian Peninsula, one of the most detailed archaeogenetic surveys of any region in Europe. The study traced the genetic transformation of Iberia from the Neolithic through the Bronze Age, watching the steppe migration arrive and reshape population after population, and then it reached the region corresponding to modern Basque territory. The steppe ancestry signal, the Yamnaya component that was rewriting European genetics everywhere else, was almost absent. Modern Basques carry less than 15% steppe-derived ancestry. Most Western Europeans carry 40 to 50%. The Basque ancestral population, according to the genetic evidence, had absorbed essentially none of the migration that restructured the rest of the continent. The Basques were not the original Europeans. They were the Europeans who were never replaced. That distinction is not semantic. It changes everything about what the Basque genetic signal actually represents. They are not the ancestors of modern Europeans. They are a surviving population that predates the genetic transformation that created modern Europeans. The two things look similar from the outside. They are opposite in meaning. The implication follows immediately. The steppe migration that reshaped the continent, that carried the Indo-European language ancestors into Europe, and replaced the DNA of populations who had lived there for millennia, passed through or around Basque territory without taking hold. The language those migrants carried spread across virtually the entire continent. It did not displace Euskara. The genetics those migrants carried entered virtually every European population. They did not enter the Basque ancestral line at comparable rates. Why not? The honest answer is that the evidence does not yet fully explain it. Isolation geography is the most cited factor. The Pyrenees created a natural barrier that may have slowed contact, but the barrier was not absolute. Other isolated mountain populations in Europe show full integration of steppe ancestry. The Basques are unusual, not just in their isolation, but in the degree to which that isolation held genetically for several thousand years after it held for essentially no one else. What the evidence does show is that the Arens negative anomaly, the language isolate status, and the archaeogenetic signal are all pointing at the same thing from different directions. The Basques carry a genetic profile that most closely resembles Bronze Age Iberians, the pre-steppe population of the Iberian Peninsula, because in critical respects they are that population. They did not evolve into something new. The continent changed around them while they remained. Counter evidence worth noting, the picture is not perfectly clean. Modern Basques do carry some steppe ancestry. The signal exists. It is simply far lower than in neighboring populations. This is not a zero-contact situation. It is an asymmetric one. The question of exactly how and why the steppe migration's genetic impact was so dramatically reduced in this specific region remains open. That openness is not a weakness in the finding. It is the part of the story that future research will have to answer. 3 million people alive today carry this signal in their cells, not as metaphor, not as cultural identity, as measurable biology, a steppe ancestry ratio that sets them apart from virtually every population on the continent they have inhabited for thousands of years. If your ancestry includes any Basque lineage, even partially, you carry a fragment of a population that survived something almost no one else survived in the same way. There is something in that worth sitting with. The genetic transformation of Europe around 3000 BCE was not a natural disaster. It was human movement, people expanding, displacing, mixing, overriding. And in one mountain corridor on the western edge of the continent, that overriding did not fully take. The population that was there stayed. The language that was spoken there, a language with no relatives, no traceable family, kept being spoken. 7,000 years later, it still is. History tends to be told by the populations that expanded. The Bronze Age steppe migrations are part of that story. A successful expansion that seeded languages and genetics across an entire continent. But success in expansion means, almost by definition, that something else did not expand. Something else held. Something else persisted quietly while the world outside it was transformed. The tooth in the clay did not confirm what anyone expected. What no one has answered yet is what kept it there. Before this video, what did you assume about the Basques, and has that changed? If you have Basque ancestry, Does a finding this old feel like it connects to you? Or does 7,000 years make it too distant to matter?